Welcome back to the Inspire369 podcast. I have another special guest, Richard Leviton. He is the author of a new book, Mythopoieic Planet. This book is amazing. He sent me a copy, and I've been reading it pretty much every day. It is amazing. This book is extremely dense. Probably one of the best books I've read, to be honest with you. Particularly about this topic. It's an extremely important book. I think everyone should be reading it. And I'm so honored to have the author here to talk about it. So Richard, let's get into it. So why don't you kind of give us an overview of the book? What is this book about?
Well, I felt like I would be daring in this book. I've written a lot of books before, and this one I wanted to do something different. And that is essentially presenting the memoirs of a person from another planet who was part of the design team that created the Earth. And the book goes back and forth between that perspective and, you might say, his residential experience on the Earth when he was dealing with the various design features that they implemented. I mean, light temples and aspects of the light grid, geometric things, ley lines, the whole complex of energy features that support consciousness and nature. And the mythopoeic part was that the Earth was seeded with multiple mythic images. And the key thing you have to know about mythic images is that they all come from a clairvoyant reality. People tend to dismiss myths as either entertaining, fantasies, or products of dead cultures. I mean, Joseph Campbell helped to resurrect the value of myths, but he didn't realize, or at least he didn't speak about, the psychic or clairvoyant aspect to it. So the mythic pictures, the gods doing one thing or another, living in palaces, the celestial cities, slaying dragons, healing the wounded Fisher King. There's a lot of different myths from cultures all around the world. They're actually psychic clues and roadmaps left by earlier initiates telling people how to interact with the planet now, using these picture images as a kind of doorway to get into the psychic reality of the subtle aspect of the planet. And so Mythopoeic Planet means the whole planet is filled with that. No matter what culture you're in, there's going to be some mythic pantheon. Some cultures are a little richer than others, or some cultures are easier to understand. For me personally, Hindu, Greek, and Norse myths are easy for me, and Native American myths, not so easy because I didn't grow up with animals, and all of their myths are based on animals. But aside from that, these are all mythic, these are all psychic clues deposited on the planet. And you could say even the planet itself is a myth. In other words, it has a destiny, it has a kind of picture that it wants to manifest to the solar system and the galaxy. And that requires all of the individual components, the light temples, all the aspects of the light grid to be worked with and put in a reasonably operating mode. Anyway, that's the intent of the book. It also reports on current geomantic work in the last year that had to do with either liberating stuck energy or adding new light to the pattern. That goes on all the time. Some light gets stuck, like caught in the crevices, you might say, and the celestial world, Great White Brotherhood, the Angelic realm, are periodically adding new infusions. So those two things are going on at the same time, and they require living people to participate. We don't have to be prodigies or ascended masters or anything to do that. We just have to show up and help. It's a collegial activity across the spectrum.
Yeah, and I really think that this book, you've been writing about this topic for a very long time. You have a number of books about this, and I think that this particular book to me is very, very much distills, I think, all of these ideas into a very digestible format. I've read a number of your books, and I think this one, to me, made the picture very clear, right? Very, very understandable, and I really appreciated that. I really like that about that. You're telling it from the story of someone who of beings who designed this system. And I think that that's really interesting. And I love when you talk about myths deposited on the planet. It kind of reminded me of the theory of there's some scientists who believe that early man developed because of using psychedelic substances like mushrooms and things like that. And I wonder if there's any truth to this idea of myth being part of that evolutionary process. Like, or is there something there where man discovering myth, right? The myth in the landscape, did that help us evolve? Did that help us grow at all?
Well, yes. Let's say if you took the totality of light temples on the planet, we're talking, without exaggeration, in the millions, because each type has multiple copies. Okay, it's like a franchise, you might say. And each of them is meant to reveal an aspect of the total nature of a human being. You might say the true cosmic picture of a human being. In other words, created out of the cosmos, with the cosmos, and then placed on the earth. So each light temple reveals a part of that. If you want to use a somewhat cliched analogy, you could say it's like a picture puzzle with 1,000 pieces. The creators know what's on the box on the outside. We're putting the pieces together without seeing the total image until it's finished. But each piece reveals an aspect of the truth of the human person in terms of a design. And once you've got a certain number of pieces assembled and, shall we say, activated or initialized or interacted with, there is a momentum happens, and the next pieces are easier. And you're building this kind of cosmic picture of your true origin. I don't mean your genetic origin, your bloodline, your parents, or culture. This is much deeper or more profound or just antecedent to all of that. So the process of interacting with these sites, using the myths as cue cards, you might say, gradually awakens consciousness, both individually and collective or culturally, or in terms of an ethnos. Like, look at, generally people think India is a fairly spiritual place compared to perhaps other countries like the United States, which is a little more materialistic oriented. Nonetheless, interaction with these myths and the sites gradually dilates consciousness, expands it. And certainly that's an evolution. I mean, you can have that evolutionary process in one lifetime. You can have it over 100 lifetimes. And then the collectivity of humanity also participates in that. And over a fairly long period of time, the entire, what's usually called the world psyche, or the noosphere, according to Teilhard de Chardin, or the term I prefer from William Blake in the English tradition is Albion. A light being in our neighborhood. It's a picture of the collective expression of all humanity over time in a kind of cosmic body on the earth that has all of the celestial aspects, in a sense, a miniature version of the entire light grid, plus the archives of everything human beings have done on the earth since they got here. It's a big picture. And that's sort of the ultimate evolutionary goal for the earth, is to awaken that Albion with everyone participating in it. Wide awake, you're not channeling, you're not astral traveling, you're not lucid dreaming, you're just wide awake, like we presume we are right now, but you're aware that you're participating in this larger being that expresses the epitome of the earth and the people living on it.
That's fascinating. That's one of the big topics of the book, is the concept of Albion, this creation of, the collective consciousness of humanity as the goal. And I think that's really fascinating. So maybe we start from kind of the beginning, in a sense. Like, can you explain a bit of, I guess let's start from the top and maybe clarify the process of top-down creation, right? From God, right, the one infinite creator, to the sublogi or galaxies, to suns, and finally to us. Okay, how does that work exactly?
Well, the basic simplified picture is that it's a hierarchy of levels of awareness. In terms of the term you introduced, logos, which is a Greek word, a nice one. It's how they refer to the supreme being without saying God, and also to the Christ as a expression of ultimate consciousness. This is before Christianity, so it wasn't a reference to the brand name go-to guy of Christianity. It was something deeper. So you have supreme being with various names. Actually, it's a Mr. and Mrs. It's masculine, feminine pairs all the way down. Mr. and Mrs. God, all the way down to any human being, outer masculine for you and me, inner feminine. If we were women, it'd be the opposite. So it's those pairs all the way down from Mr. and Mrs. God. Unfortunately, the three religions of Abraham edited out all the feminine aspects. There's no Mrs. God, there's no Mrs. Christ, and it's basically a patriarchal model. So some things got edited out. Anyway, so you have the supreme being, and then you have the Christ or the Logos, which again, I emphasize is not the product of Christianity. It's more like what Rudolf Steiner said, that the Christ is a cosmic fact, right? And you could just as well call, technically the Christ is the same as the Buddha and the other names as well. So I'm trying to make it clear that I'm not talking in terms of the Christian model, because that's, no offense, that's sort of a cartoon version for children as far if you compare it with the actual metaphysical reality. They just edited out about 90%. Okay, then you've got the Logos, which knows the name of God. This is sort of going through the Judaic Kabbalistic model. And then you have the cosmic Logos, which knows the 72 names of God. The original name of God, according to Jewish tradition, has 216 letters. And they say, if you mispronounce that name, you're going to destroy the universe. They're probably exaggerating. But anyway, so the Logos, Christ or Buddha and other names, knows that name and can pronounce it. Then you have the cosmic Logos, which knows the 72 names of God. And then you have the solar Logos, which is not to do with individual stars, but galaxies. And the solar Logos knows all the names of the stars, the 200, 300 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. The solar Logos knows all of them. And that figure, by the way, is the same as what Theosophy calls the chief of the Great White Brotherhood. Or if you're a Hindu, it's Indra, the chief of the gods. Or if you're British and a Celtic enthusiast, it's King Arthur. Solar Logos, the Christ at the level of stars. So it's a hierarchy. And then you get down to the planet, in this case, Earth. Again, you have a dual pair. You have Gaia and Pan. Gaia is somewhat feminine expression of the total consciousness of the Earth, and particularly to do with landscape angels and egregores of countries. And then Pan is the guy who runs all the nature spirits, gnomes, fairies, sylphs, the elementals, the ensouling intelligences of the different elements of nature. So, I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's the essential hierarchy. And then you have the angelic realm, which consists of 40 different families, not 10, 40. Somehow 30 got edited out over the centuries, but there's actually 40. And this is a complete spectrum of pure, original, unfallen, undifferentiated levels of consciousness. It's hard to even comprehend what that means. In other words, never having incarnated or being stuck in time. That's unfallen, undifferentiated. And they have roles to play. I don't think all 40 of them are intimately involved with the Earth. There's at least, between my experience, between 6 and 10 are, you're going to encounter them quite often if you're actually working with the like grid of the Earth in a real sense, because you're actually colleagues. Well, we're junior colleagues to them. So you've got Great White Brotherhood, Angelic Realm, the different levels of the Logos, Solar Logos, Cosmic Logos, and the Logos, they all come into play. They are not remote and inaccessible to human consciousness, and it doesn't require worship or prostration or any kind of sucking up to deities. They need colleagues on the ground, and they're perfectly willing, very politely, to regard us as hobbits of promise. We're not Aragorn, we're not Gandalf, we're hobbits, but we have a little bit of ability. Plus, the hobbits saved Middle Earth anyway in that story. So all of these components have to come together when you're doing anything in terms of interacting with light temples with the intent of either cleaning out dark areas or introducing more light to the planet. And part of the training of someone doing this, traditionally the job description was Grail Knight. It's an old term from the medieval period, but it's still relevant and somewhat charming because it's so old. Required having working relations with all these different spectrums, all these different groups of beings. And that requires clairvoyance. You have to be able to see the stuff, or at least reasonably. Otherwise, you're working in the dark. And working in the dark, if you're a plumber and you get called to a house and it's all boarded up and there's no lights on, you may be able to find the sink, but you may undo the wrong pipes because you can't see the correct ones, right? So you actually need to be able to see stuff, and that requires clairvoyance. It's different than being psychic. Psychics tend to depend on spirits to tell them this and that, and you really need a stricter epistemological basis because sometimes spirits want to mislead you. You have to be able to vet them on your own as if you were a spy evaluating espionage information. As John le Carré used to say in his books, if you trust the source, then it's the starting point for trusting the information. Anyway, clairvoyance means you're seeing who you're working with in a relative sense. I mean, the paradox of clairvoyance is you realize everything on the other side of the physical world does not have a totally fixed and absolute and unchanging appearance. The angelic realm, only the Western traditions see angels with wings. If you look at the Asian tradition, they don't see wings. They see giant halos and bubbles of light, right? So there's no absolutely accurate picture. But on the other hand, if you have a group of a dozen trained clairvoyants, you'll get about 80% overlap in terms of image, which is enough. I mean, that would qualify for what Rudolf Steiner called the dictums of spiritual science. You conduct your research into the total picture of the world just like a scientist would, but you're not an atheist materialist. You're including the clairvoyance as a research tool because reality is much bigger than what normal science addresses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, one of those things where, what we see mentally, right, in a dream state or astral state or clairvoyantly, right, is influenced by, our culture, is influenced by our experiences and et cetera. And, it's trying to get to the truth, right, or at least partly there, which is what you said, 80%, right? And and that's where the power of that comes in. And so a lot in your book, you speak about the Ofanim a lot and the Elohim a lot, right? And so they're very much involved in the design of the light grid and the maintenance of that, right? So do you want to kind of touch on that a bit?
Well, the Ofanim are a high-ranking family of angels. They're actually the first created family out of 40. Their name means wheels. Ophan is Hebrew for wheels, and all the angelic orders get a complimentary I am at the end. It's a Hebrew nomenclature thing. And technically, the Ofanim are the wheels of God's chariot, the Merkabah. You can see the Supreme Being sitting in a throne, or you can see the Supreme Being sitting in a chariot. Either way, Ofanim are the wheels. They move the Supreme Being throughout the universe, which means they're very close to the Supreme Being, and therefore they're in charge of everything to do with consciousness, all of the deployment of consciousness, awareness, discernment, cognition. And they sharpen it, they inspire it, they guide it. And they also have a lot of fun creating very plausible metaphors of what their energy is like. And people will be surprised that they probably have heard of some of the guises of the Ofanim, but don't realize it was them. For example, Ganesh, the jolly elephant god of India who sits on his butt and tells jokes and hands out boons to everybody. That's the Ofanim. The majestic eagle that carries Mr. and Mrs. Christ around, Vishnu and Shri, called Garuda. That's them. If you ever read the Ramayana, Hanuman, a really scary, large monkey, like 50 feet tall, who moves mountains, that's them. In Hindu mythology, Indra, the chief of the gods or chief of the Great White Brotherhood, rides a majestic white elephant with 6 golden tusks. That's the Ofanim also. And it goes on and on. There's a lot of different guises for them to illustrate aspects of consciousness that are implicit in every human, but might need a little bit of a catalytic input to get them going. The Elohim, which is a confusing name to begin with, because in the Judaic and Christian tradition, God is often referred to as Elohim, but Elohim is also the name of an angelic order. So I'm talking about the angelic order. And they're basically humanity's godparents. They shepherded the design, especially of the light body aspects of the human, the chakras, layers of the aura, and the various treasures that are deposited in them. They sort of shepherded the design and the manifestation of that. And they installed all the megalithic features around the planet. Anything to do with stones, pyramids, standing stones, stone circles, stone rows, weird hills like Silbury and Glastonbury Tor. Yeah, it's them. They did that stuff. And they did it in such a way that it was in alignment or in congruence with the design of the human, which they also participated in. And their name itself is usually spelled El, but in the Kabbalistic model of God names, it's spelled Al, Aleph Lamed. And it's a kind of very potent creative power associated with the crown chakra. And they're the wielders of it. So they're pretty important. And I've seen them many times. And one of the first times I saw them, they didn't look like angels. They looked like ancient kings and queens, like you might expect from, if you read any Iranian mythology, it goes back a long time, or even somewhat suggestive of Tolkien, but more like of the elves. Anyway, very regal. They also have appeared as the Cyclopes. All the giants of mythology, in the Odyssey, Polyphemus, who was sort of a not such a smart guy living in a cave, a giant, and Odysseus tricked him and all that business. That was a Cyclope. A Cyclope is the one with the one eye. And the Greek tradition portrayed them as basically morons, but I don't know. The cultures tend to change things that they're uncomfortable with. What that one eye actually means is that all of the chakras, the 7 chakras and the 50 petals are all in one place, right in the forehead, in the brow. And the one eye means they have a unified vision. They never lose track of what the Supreme Being had in mind. And the chakras never got differentiated. Because technically, I mean, this begs the question if people have even heard of chakras, but chakras themselves represent a fallen condition. Because it's like, instead of having unified vision, you have a committee of 7, and they each have a different opinion. Those are the chakras, from the brow to the root chakra, correlated with the emotions, somewhat with the hormonal system, the sort of subjective emotionality of people. At a higher level, they're all light temples of the gods. But still, they represent a fallen condition because it's hard to get all 7 to see the same thing. Whereas if you're a Cyclope with the one round eye, you never lose it. Anyway, that's what the Cyclopes are, and that's what the Elohim were.
That's fascinating. Yes, I totally get what you're saying. Like, there's unity, right? And then there's a condition we're in, right? Disunity or disharmony, whatever. So like where, you have the pullings of the lower and then the pullings of the higher, right? And then you have us in the middle and kind of choosing between. Sometimes the lower wins, sometimes the higher wins. And there's us in our existential struggle to constantly battle between our animal side and our angelic side, so to speak, which is interesting. You have in the book, kind of just going through, the terms I think people should understand to get a framework, right? So that you talk about the Hierophancy heuristic algorithm. Do you want to kind of talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think I pronounced it Hierophancy.
Hierophancy. Okay, I'm sorry.
Not your fault. I made up that word, so don't worry.
Okay.
So, that is something that, let's say I intuited. I either remembered it or I made it up. Sometimes when I'm writing these books, there's a fine line between what I'm remembering, what the Ofanim might be suggesting, and possibly what I might be making up. It's sometimes hard to draw the line. The Hierophancy heuristic algorithm, the concept there is that I'm convinced that, okay, I have to talk about levels first. Physical planet, okay, that's easy. Then you have the light grid, which is a complex geometric pattern or a nest of geometric forms and lines of light and light temples and lots of stuff. It's like Disneyland on steroids or something. It's just very complex. It supports consciousness, not just of humans, but of all sentient being, well, actually all of nature, sentient or not, which sort of means self-aware. And then you have a more abstract geometric level to it, known as the Platonic solids. There are 5 geometric forms that are unique and obey certain principles, and they each correspond to one of the 5 elements of nature, as in earth, fire, air, water, and ether. But then above that, there is a mathematical level. You could say the light grid and even the physical planet was originally scripted like computer code. Although I don't want it to sound like it's a science fiction movie of coding a planet, but there is mathematics involved, and algorithms are a way of approaching that. The Hierophancy heuristic algorithm is a postulated master mathematical formula that runs the entire planet and its light grid in an automatic but not artificial intelligence manner, but still in an automatic regulatory manner. The heuristic means it learns, it adapts. And the hierophancy, it's a wonderful word. I originally got it from Mircea Eliade, who was sort of like a more scholarly version of Joseph Campbell. Well, not that Joseph wasn't scholarly, but Eliade wasn't as famous. He was sort of more academic, but wrote lots of good books. And hierophant, is what the word that hierophancy derives from. It means the revealer of the holy light. And that means the pattern, the structure, the light grid. Here is the essence of the Grail Castle. The Hierophant is the one who reveals it. It's a way show. It's a cool word. So hierophancy is just a variation on that. It means, well, I wrote an earlier book called The Hierophancy Files, and I pretended, since I was a great fan of the X-Files, as probably a lot of people are or were, and there was another series out of England called The Laundry Files, which was a postulated occult group working as part of MI6 or something. It dealt with monsters and Lovecraft-type intrusions into reality. So I postulated a group that dealt with the light grid, and they're called the Hierophancy. It's just, I made it up, but it is plausible. So anyway, the theory is that there is a master mathematical formula and algorithm with layers and layers, of course, that runs the planet, but can also be adjusted and is not in any way capable of becoming tyrannical, because there's still the realm, the angelic, Great White Brotherhood, humans, etc., need to modulate and adjust. So it doesn't quite fit the normal notions of artificial intelligence or automatic computer systems, but the main point I want people to realize is that there's probably a mathematical aspect to the entire light grid. And in fact, you could describe the light grid in one of 2 ways. You can either use myths, or psychic pictures, or you could describe it in terms of math, prime numbers, and all the different mathematical and natural constants. There's formulas like pi and phi and e, which has to do with logarithmic expansion. Probably wouldn't have too many readers if you did it that way, but it is a plausible way to describe the Earth. Because if you're designing something, and that really points to the important principle of the Earth, that it was an engineered project. It was designed in advance, and engineering is actually the way to approach it. Yes, it's sacred. Yes, it's spiritual, but those words don't really get you anywhere, because you have to actually understand the pattern, and it's complicated. On the other hand, it's not so complicated you can't understand it, but it does require a little bit of application. It's like a very complex machine, very in quote marks, and you need to you need to know how it works in terms of expecting any kind of useful interaction with it.
Yeah, and that's one of the really interesting things about your work is you kind of break that down in a very interesting way, just because, you know, it seems like the light grid acts as, and you say this in your book, it acts as like the etheric body of the planet, right? So the etheric field of a human is the template reality. It's where, things are thought of, and then they're essentially, it's like the place, the realm where ideas are, right? And we're in the physical where things are created and solidified. And so we all have an etheric body, and the earth does as well. And so the idea that we can interact with that etheric body, and by interacting with it, we can produce changes in the physical, is just a fascinating concept. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
It's actually a little bigger than that. Yes, we have an etheric body, but we have another 5 bodies beyond that. We have a total of 7. One of them is physical, 6 are subtle. And they all have chakras. They all have layers of the aura. 567 chakras, 50 layers of the aura, 7 bodies. Earth has the same pattern. So the components of the light grid are distributed throughout a number of those layers. You see what I mean? Not just the etheric. There's also the astral, the mental. Everybody has different names for them, but the quantity is correct. There's 7 layers. So the light grid is distributed throughout a number of layers. Each of them has different requirements for seeing, for interacting. You could say has different engineering protocols and sensitivities. And they all maintain consciousness and the physical world. And they are all potentially hierophantic. They will reveal the holy light to people who interact with them. Why do you want to know the holy light? Who can answer the question, why are you here on the earth as a human being? Why do you exist? Religions pretend to give you an answer, but my generation, turned to Buddhism and Hinduism, non-Christian things, found those answers insufficient. And frankly, I think any really intelligent person will find them insufficient as well, because they eliminate too many things. It's sort of like a theory of a crime that doesn't accommodate all the clues, sort of tries to squeeze things into a model and leaves out the clues that don't fit. Well, the light grid actually includes all the clues and potentially can give you an answer to that. I mean, it's not going to be in words exactly. It's going to be in a revelation, a disclosure, an inner experience that if you've ever read any of the literature of near-death experiences, let's say it's like that times 100, right? Big revelation, because it's a big question. Why do you exist? Why does the earth exist? What are we supposed to do? How long do we have to stay here? What's the point of it? What was Supreme Being thinking when he and she came up with all this crazy stuff? I mean, I think about that every day. To me, the light grid is how you get an answer. It's actually a self-service information kiosk. You want to know why you exist, why reality exists, why the earth exists, the light grid is the answer. The answer is already here. It does take a little application. You do need clairvoyance, otherwise you won't be able to see anything or understand what's happening. And you don't want to trust all the beings that you might come encounter with, because just like in espionage, there's false information and double agents and pretend spies and everything. So you need a little bit of discernment. Nonetheless, the light temples are there to progressively and incrementally answer your question. On the other hand, if you don't care, you don't have to do it. But you may die totally perplexed, and the minute you get into the bardo or the afterlife, that perplexity is going to accompany you. Just being dead doesn't necessarily answer the questions. Rudolf Steiner said the best time to deal with those primary existential questions is while you're alive. Then, when you're dead, you're not a complete idiot staggering around the astral world, not having a clue. Anyway, that's a way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this kind of goes into a little bit of I guess we could talk about Earth history, right? And the in your books, you speak about the first humans, right? And how they mismanaged and abused the light grid. Do you want to talk about it a bit?
Well, technically, humans have been created 4 times. If you read the references in the Judaic and Mayan tradition that refer to the first attempts, they were complete failures. One of the attempts, I think the second one, and you can't take this quite literally, although if you read the Mayan text, the Popol Vuh, V-U-W, V-U-H, they say that the second group of humans had faces or bodies that looked like they were made of wood. I dreamed about those guys once. It's like, imagine someone with loads and loads of wrinkles such that it makes their face look like it's made of wood. Anyway, they were a failure. The third one, Supreme Being got it right, or the Elohim got it right. They were humans. The generation memorialized by the names Lilith and Pandora, which, of course, unfairly blames women for the failure of the culture. It had nothing to do with it. They were more like code names, like saying an American, right? If you say, I'm an American, that's not a gender term. It's a place of origin. So Pandora and Lilith were actually collective reference terms for an entire demographic. Okay, so the humans were placed on the earth in this third attempt. And here's the tricky thing, because the Judeo-Christian tradition says the reason the Supreme Being flooded and destroyed all of first humanity, you know, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the ancient cities of Sumeria, and it said they were bad because they had unlicensed sexual activity. They did abysmal things like that. It had nothing to do with sex at all. It had to do with an abuse of the occult powers of the chakras called siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I. They're right in front of us all the time in movies. If you watch X-Men and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Superman and all the other superhero movies, they are all demonstrating some of these occult powers of the chakras. They don't use the words, but that's where they come from. That's what they're talking about. And third generation humanity got intoxicated by the power aspects of these powers of the chakras. For example, the solar plexus chakra, which is the metabolic area of the body between the belly button and the sternum, the occult power associated with that is called Darduri. And it's quite amusing. It means the ability to leap like a frog. I saw this once, long ago, when I was living in Glastonbury, when I was just a hobbit. In other words, I didn't have a clue about anything, right? But everything was wild and crazy and interesting. The Ofanim said, go sit on this hill, see what happens. So I did that in Glastonbury, the town itself. And I saw what, in my language of the time, I would have said look like shamans or indigenous medicine people, whatever, bouncing their butts as if on a trampoline and ending up 30 miles away on another site. I saw them doing this. Wonder if there's that, because there's no guidebooks at these sites explaining what you're seeing, like it's a theme park. You have to figure it out. It took me a long time to figure it out, like 20 years. So I met somebody else who showed me a place in Yosemite, a scary place in California with all the steep cliffs and huge rocks and everything. And she said that such a place was her favorite place of all time. She'd been there 100 times. We went there, and I saw these shamans bouncing off trampolines from this one site to another. Eventually, I put it together when I came across a accurate list of the occult powers of the chakras, that one of the powers of the solar plexus is to be able to move your body from point A to B like a frog. The frog is a metaphor from point A to B. Oh, and here's the joke. The destination of these shamans bouncing on a trampoline from Glastonbury to somewhere else was about 20 miles away, and its local nickname was the Hill of Frogs. Everybody thought, oh, it means a big frog population or some nonsense like this. No, it's a Hill of Frogs because that has one of those chakra trampolines that enables you to basically teleport yourself from one place to the other, like a frog jumping from a lily pad to another. Okay. Now you think, well, that can't be weaponized. You can't use that against somebody else. Well, you could if you're wanted to do a stealth attack on somebody. Anyway, the point is, these occult powers of the chakras are neutral. They can be used to benefit people or they can be used as weapons. And this generation of humanity got seduced into using them as weapons for fighting, for control, for power, for domination. And it got to such a point where it actually destabilized the planet. They introduced, via their occult probing of subtle realms, beings and spirits that did not belong in the physical world. If you ever read any H.P. Lovecraft, all the weirdness in his books, there's actually reality to that. That was partly that generation of Lilith and Pandora opened doors that weren't supposed to, sort of like letting in invaders to Earth reality that were just not appropriate or congruent and were ultimately pathogenic on a psychic level. Anyway, Supreme Being, in a rare fit of being totally annoyed, that that's it. You're destabilizing the Earth. The solar system is getting wobbly and actually manifesting even beyond the solar system out into the Milky Way galaxy. We got to put an end to it. So he did. Drowned everybody. It had nothing to do with sex. It had to do with the misuse of psychic powers.
So their actions were their actions were destabilizing not only the Earth but wider. Like they were basically the whole universe. Network of, well, that's how astrology works. Like they say Jupiter is squaring this or Saturn is conjunct this. Well, so what? The answer to the so what is that those astronomical geometric configurations have a kind of vibrational effect on everyone on the Earth, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's complicated to explain astrology, but it's based on that kind of constant interaction between what's happening on the Earth and what's happening in the rest of the solar system. Sort of like living in a large family. We have 7, 9 planets, even Pluto. Astronomers said it didn't exist as a planet, but it sure acts like one. Anyway, they're constantly exerting subtle effects on consciousness. And your personal horoscope, which is a map of the state of the solar system when you were born, and therefore it's actually a 4th dimensional light grid that you walk around in all the time, and is constantly being nudged and pushed and squared and irritated and aggravated and made happy, how should I say, carrying happy feelings or carrying angry feelings. It's a real circus. Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to astrology because in your book, you mentioned some very interesting things about astrology that I wanted to talk about. But I just want to go back a second to when you mentioned seeing the shamans bouncing. Obviously, you didn't see them in the physical world. You saw it clairvoyantly, right? And that's kind of what you're trying to say, I guess. Yeah,
you could say it was a memory in the landscape.
Right. And so that's interesting because there's this TV show called Devs, which is about a group in Silicon Valley, a company which creates a quantum computer that can take any memory from history and visualize it, and it's pretty fascinating. So they can see, Jesus on the cross, and Joan of Arc, and things like that. So it sounds a little bit like that, right? When you're
that's fabricated. What I'm talking about is what the esoteric tradition calls the Akashic records.
Right.
The etheric field of the planet, just like the human, is where all the memories are stored. So you could go to a landscape site, Glastonbury, Sedona, Lourdes in France, any place like that, and potentially read out the history of that place over time as if you're watching a documentary. It has been recorded in the etheric field of that place, for better or worse. If you did this at former Nazi concentration camps, it would be like watching a horror movie. If you did it in other places where the activities were more benign and tending towards enlightenment, it would be quite inspiring. So the memories are already there. What you're referring to is a way of demonstrating the principle, but it's not real ultimately. What I'm talking about is actually there. It's real. You can read it. You can see it. And sometimes you can even go to a place and encounter yourself from a past life. In other words, this actually, you should expect that if you visit enough sacred sites, that sooner or later you're going to encounter a place that in a past life you had an experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant, and there are still memories of it there for you to observe and assimilate or to get free from.
Fascinating. Yeah, I use the example of devs as like a way to basically, like, as an analogy, basically for what you were saying. So it sounds interesting.
You're actually pointing out something important. I've noticed over the years, like the last 40 years, that technological innovations tend to illustrate principles of the subtle world, like radio in terms of clairaudience, TV, clairvoyance, the internet is a kind of illustration of the constant, thorough connectivity of the light grid and its connection with larger fields of energy. In other words, technological innovations are materialized forms of psychic realities. So you can sort of track them. And the one you just mentioned is relevant in that sense. It reveals yet another aspect, the Akashic memory of landscapes.
Yeah, fascinating. And now we have AI, generative AI, which is, I guess, analogous to, astral, right? The idea of creation, dreams, that kind of thing.
It's actually congruent with, that mathematical phrase I have, the Hierophancy heuristic algorithm, except that one has limits and inherent controls on it. Basically, when you have artificial intelligence, whether it's an algorithm running the planet or the more outward forms of it, you have two choices. You have Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, where the robots were designed, he wrote about this in the 1950s, in such a way that they absolutely cannot harm humans or take over anything. And then on the other side of it, you have the unlimited open-ended artificial intelligence. If you ever saw the TV series Person of Interest for 5 years, it basically had 2 competing AIs, one that had limits and one that didn't have limits. And the one that didn't have limits ends up being the Terminator scenario from those movies, where they take over and basically consider humans to be a waste of space. So it's a thing that requires a lot of just discernment. And the algorithm I'm referring to is sort of in the middle of the two. It's adjustable. It can be interacted with. It'll never become tyrannical. So it's a big topic.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And so that's kind of, the role of humans, right, is to maintain that, right? And kind of, I guess let's take a step back and talk about the role of planets, right? So we have the scientific idea of planet formation, right? There's chaos, rocks forming, boom, and then gravity and whatnot, and forms into a sphere, and there's your planet. In your ideas, the concept is the Earth is planned, and the only way that life can be sustained is by having a light grid, right? You want to kind of touch on that a bit?
Well, yeah, it's more like the Earth was made to order. Yes, I respect science and the scientific mind. I also appreciate its limitations because it's based on an atheist materialist model, and that in turn based on 4% of visible reality. The other 96% dark matter and dark energy is what clairvoyance sees. It's dark because you can't see it. If you're clairvoyant, you can. Well, in my experience, here's an example. There's a place in England called Avebury. It's a big stone circle, huge stones that look really weird, look like very old stones that have lost some of their original shape. It's 30 miles north of Stonehenge. The Druids always go to Stonehenge and leave Avebury alone, but technically Avebury is where it's at. Anyway, one of the times I was there, I stood next to one of these stones, and the Elohim, this angelic order, showed me how they precipitated the stones out of the etheric field. They did not quarry them. They did not dig them. They did not carry them on the backs or in carts or whatever theory archaeologists come up with. They precipitated them right on the spot, like a short order cook in a restaurant, out of the etheric field and put them right in place. They dug the holes, put the stones in. All the megalithic features on the planet were precipitated in the same way. Well, They next showed me a few years later, they did the same thing with the Earth. I know it totally contradicts scientific theory and etc. I can't help it. They showed it to me, and I believe it had some relevance because the scientific model is, frankly, to me, just too stupid. Even the worst science fiction writers can come up with better models than accidental collisions, and it miraculously ends up being almost spherical. That's nonsense. It's all designed and engineered. I mean, buildings don't just accidentally appear like skyscrapers, they get built. Well, anyway, I know it's heretical and I can't prove it, but I did see it. And the Elohim showed me how they precipitated the Earth. First, they created the light grid, which is like an armature or an infrastructure, or a bit like paper mache, the original frame for a paper mache thing that you then put the material over. They created the light grid of the 5 platonic solids, which is a very complicated form. It's called a nest. And you can look up in geometry books to see pictures of them. Tetrahedron, a cube, an octahedron is names for them. A lot of different facets. Put them all together. But then they started adding, how should I say, precipitating matter out of the etheric field. And they precipitated water out of the astral light. And they precipitated the plant world out of the angelic consciousness. And this last one was sort of amusing. They precipitated the whole rocky stone aspect out of the face of God. Now I have to explain this. In Greek mythology, there are the 3 Gorgon sisters. These are described as very ugly female spirits living in a cave at the far end of the world, the western end of the world, which to the Greeks meant the universe. One of them used to be very attractive, but she insulted Pallas Athena, one of the gods, and Pallas Athena turned into an ugly female-looking spirit. Okay, that's the Greek myth. And Gorgon Medusa, she's the one with the snakes for hair, sort of the original form of dreadlocks. If you were sufficiently unfortunate to look her right in the eye, you'd be turned to stone, petrified. Okay, well, that's the Greek story. The Jewish myths in the Kabbalistic tradition have something similar to that without all the snakes and the rest of it. They say that the Supreme Being, or Ancient of Days, has 3 heads. They're all esoteric. One of them is potentially perceivable by humans. The other 2, forget it. They're way too abstract and esoteric. You never understand them. Those are the 2 Gorgon sisters who never come out of the cave. The one who comes out of the cave is the head of the Supreme Being that you could possibly perceive. Now, the turning to stone thing means stone represents the uniform density of Godhood. It means if you're ready to return to God, you're going to turn to stone. You go back to God essence, which is stone-like. They're all metaphors. So Medusa turning you to stone means you saw the Supreme Being naked and unprepared, and or you were ready to return to God. In other words, you're not going to incarnate anymore. You're finished. You're done. You're retired, so to speak. And you were turned to stone, which means you return to the original God essence you started with. And let me just add one more thing. This business of stone, because these myths are so cool when you follow them through and understand what they meant. The Freemasonry tradition, as well as Taoism, uses the image of stone in terms of a rough, uncut stone or the perfect stone. The Freemasons use the term ashlar. And I saw this once when I was being tutored years ago in Glastonbury, in the Glastonbury era. One of my sort of celestial teachers showed me this giant stone and said, "This is my stone. What do you think?" And I haven't a clue what you're talking about. But what it meant was everyone is given something that looks like one of the stones of Stonehenge. Easy to picture, a big monolith, sort of a big rectangle, or even a little bit like the stones from 2000 and the movie 2001 and 2010, a monolith. And the goal or the assignment is over a multitude of lifetimes, you are invited or expected to shape it into, well, I'll use an analogy, a grail chalice. That's just one way of describing it. You're supposed to sort of, through your life experience, shape it into a receptive vessel that can hold the light of the Christ, the Buddha, the Supreme Being, so that you can then return it to the Supreme Being. Say, look, I did it. Anyway, it's the image of shaping a rough stone into a perfect stone. So that's sort of the front end of this same myth of being petrified. Hope we can follow that.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And you mentioned, I think last time we talked, I asked a question, why stone for these monuments, for Stonehenge and Avebury and stuff like that? And it's because it holds light, it holds a frequency, right? Holds energy.
I asked the Ofanim once the exact same question. I said, how come they use stone? Because stone will hold the frequency for a long time. Maybe because it's so slow and Taurian, it's just going to stay that way, stuck in its habitual ways. But it does. That's why you can go to Avebury, which, by the way, its age has to be calculated in the billions of years. Because Avebury, I didn't say this earlier, its function is to be the umbilicus of the entire planet, connecting to the mother and father source in the galaxy, the star Sirius and the star Canopus, silver and gold. Anyway, that's the prime umbilicus. Well, in a human being, the umbilicus is not added later on. It's implicit at the very beginning of the formation of the fetus. So the Earth's umbilicus, by that same logic, had to be there at the beginning. And the stones, the stone circle, which was based on mathematical principles, and each stone carrying a light pillar, and it's a portal to other places and access to light temples, that had to be installed early on to act as an umbilicus, especially since humans, even if we take the third attempt to create humans, the ones who abuse the psychic powers, we're talking millions of years ago for those people. Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, in her books Isis Unveiled and Secret Doctrine from the late 1800s, gave a date for late Lemurian culture as 14 million years ago. And Lemuria was, that came before Atlantis, but it's still, there was quite a lot of things happening on the planet before that. Hyperborea, and Steiner even refers to a time period called Polaria, a time of plants. So the point is, the stones at Avebury and the creation of Avebury as an umbilicus has to be almost as old as the Earth, which scientists say is 4.5 billion years old. I know it's completely heretical. Elohim creating the planet, the umbilicus being over multiple billions of years old. It totally goes against standard archaeological, anthropological models. Nonetheless, there is some empirical basis for it. And if you go to Avebury and you have a little bit of psychic ability, you can potentially see sort of residual images of the Elohim precipitating stones. And to my logical mind, or maybe it's metaphysical, or maybe I got dropped on my head too many times when I was young, but let's just say it seems like a defensible proposition to say if they created the stones that way, why not the planet as well? Precipitating it according to an engineering diagram, putting in the light grid first, precipitating the elements, the 5 basic elements, and then the periodic table of elements, the 100 or so building blocks, and then humanity and the nature kingdoms, plant kingdom, and mineral kingdoms to populate the planet. All I can say is, if you read any of Rudolf Steiner, which I read a lot because I wrote a book about him, you'll find that, the way I put it, you often have to stand on your head and read backwards to make sense of what he's saying, because he turns everything upside down, yet I think he's still right. Well, I'm probably worse than that in terms of maybe you stand upside down, read backwards, and while you're pirouetting or something. In other words, it's possible that the actual and accurate reality of the planet, the history of the planet, and the provenance, how old it is radically different than what passes for consensus reality and established, quote, academic knowledge today, which may just be lacking, radically lacking.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I guess when we were talking about the Avebury being the umbilicus, now I wonder if the continents have shifted over the millennia, right? So, or the millions of years, right? So, at least it established, scientific consensus is that, the Earth was one continent, it split up, and, various reasons for that, tectonic plate movements and stuff. So where Avebury is now, likely wasn't where it was, 14 million years ago, or even earlier than that. So is it the location, or is it the land itself that contains the umbilicus, or does it matter where the location is, I guess? And it kind of goes into the idea of the Earth tilt, right? You talk about how the Earth moved to 23.5 and how that kind of screwed up everything with the grid and things like that. So maybe that kind of ties into that, if you want to touch on that a bit.
Well, you've introduced two big topics. Let me address the spatial one first. I've pondered that for a long time because, yes, the model of Pangaea, the single continent that then broke up into various different units and drifting around, continents drifting around and reforming and separating. What does that do to the original light grid pattern? I haven't come up with a satisfactory answer yet to that, in terms of explaining it to myself. But I'd say there is, at least regarding the umbilicus, there is a fixity of location, just as your belly button is not going to be anywhere else than in the mid part of your body. That's where every human being was attached to the mother inside the uterus with the umbilical cord. And so whether it's, I can't even answer it. Somehow or other, Avebury, which actually means where we buried the light. I asked Blaise, the Ofanim, what did you mean by that once? It says it's where we buried the light. AVE is a variation on the Hebrew AWR, which means light. So where we buried the light. The light, well, it's complicated, but where we buried the light that illuminates consciousness. Let me address the second one because that's easier. I talked about Supreme Being totally losing it with that generation abusing the powers. I mean, that's established biblical tradition. That part is actually accurate. The destabilization of the earth was so intense that a lot of things happened at once. Humanity was completely extirpated, all drowned, everyone. And that was such a traumatic effect, both physically and psychically. It actually destabilized the orbit and alignment of the planet and created the tilt. The planet was designed to have a straight up axial orientation. The year was designed to be 360 days and not 365.25, which is an aberration. Another thing that happened was the mountains rose up, either from volcanism or tectonic shifts, but the mountains were not an original feature of the planet. The planet was originally a smooth globe, like a bald, like a bald person, no hair, no mountains. If you look at Iranian mythology, they talk about, they have their own names for it, but they said the mountains arose when the chief bad guy of the universe killed their version of Albion. And that destabilized the planet and the mountains rose up. That mythology also foresees a time when all the mountains will collapse and the constituent metals will all melt. Of course, by metals, they meant chakras, the whole hierarchy of chakras. They use the term metals for that. So anyway, the mountains are not an original part of the planet, nor were the seasons. If you read some of the Greek accounts from Herodotus and some of the other writers from that time period, they talked about Hyperborea, which they understood to be a paradisal land roughly in the northwest of Greece, which puts it in the British Isles, Scandinavia, Greenland, even up to the Antarctic. I mean, it's sort of vaguely defined, but it's definitely considered in the north. The weather was perpetually springtime. This is right in Herodotus. Perpetually springtime, there was a gigantic circular temple. That's probably Avebury. People just hung around and danced and played music, sort of like Woodstock, 1969 Woodstock, with maybe an early form of Jimi Hendrix, who knows. And then the mountains arose and completely perturbed that placid world environment of perpetual spring. The mountains rose up, meteorology began because mountains modulate weather, as you know. They create it, they stop it, wind and snowstorms and the rest. And the precession of the equinox, which I have the impression most people take for granted as an indigenous part of the design of the planet, that's an aberration too. Things are not supposed to go backwards like that. Everything got screwed up when Supreme Being removed that generation of humanity. It was a tumultuous removal with consequences, physical and psychic, and we're still living in them. The Earth is not supposed to be tilted. The year's supposed to be 360 degrees because all of the numeration of the numbers of light temples and the copies all are based on multiples of 9. 360 is a multiple of 9. 365 is just a useless aberration. It's like metric. It hides all the sacred numbers. You can't get oriented in the original design with metric or with 365.25 days. It's an aberration. It's a perturbation. It's off. Same with the rising up of mountains. I know you mentioned in your communication with me that people consider mountains sacred. Yes, but with no offense to the mountains have nothing to do with it. They're irrelevant. It's not the rocks and the earth and the plants that are sacred. It's the light temple that is superimposed in the same place as the mountain. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I went to Mount Shasta in California for first week of January. It's called the Epiphany Week. And Mount Shasta is a big mountain. If you've seen pictures of it, it's like 14,000 feet tall or something, snow on it most of the time. And in January, there's lots of snow. So you could only drive a certain distance up the mountain. And the Ofanim wanted me to go there and meditate. And for a while, I had to use snowshoes to hike in a little bit. And when I first got out of the car, even though I'd been there before, it was scary. I thought, ooh, I was slightly intimidated. It was a little edgy. Then I thought, no, you got this all backwards. Okay, the physical mountain is impressive. It's looks too steep to climb, and etc. That's irrelevant. What you're actually registering is your own Buddha nature. I was trained as a Buddhist. That's the term. You could say it's the same as your own God essence, your own Christ essence, whatever, your soul essence. And the mountain was a physical carrier of the light field of various light temples there that were a reflection or just another version of the true nature of my consciousness. Not just mine. If you were there, it would have been yours too. In other words, of any humans. And that's what a sacred site does. It reflects back something profound that you're actually is part of you. So you're going to prostrate to yourself? In other words, saying a site is sacred is almost irrelevant. It's just doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, sure, you want to respect the place, but it's actually reflecting an aspect of the truth of your consciousness. So when I realized that, I said, oh, I get it. This mountain and its etheric or subtle infrastructure around it is a reflection of a truth of the human being. And then I said, oh, that is cool. Let me add it. I'm going to meditate. It sort of gets some more of that.
That's interesting. Well, I think I might have in some way answered the very first question, at least for me, is like the idea of like, well, regardless of whether or not Mount Shasta was there, the light temple existed. And that's what's
a recent arrival.
Right, exactly, right.
Contemplated at the beginning of the planet.
Right.
Oh, thanks for bringing it up. Let me just clarify this. When the mountains rose up, in many cases, it created a subluxation between where the light temple was and the physical thing called the mountain. Subluxation is a term from chiropractic. It means your vertebrae are out of alignment. I like that term because human consciousness and the physical world is subluxated from the lycra, out of alignment, largely to do with the tilt and the precession and the destabilization I meant, right? So in many cases, it'll be as if there's something wrong with your site because let's say it's a Grail castle. That's an easy kind of light temple. It doesn't seem to be quite in the same place as the mountain. It's close, but not quite, as if it's shifted a little bit. That's because when the mountains or volcanoes rose up, it was not according to the original engineering protocols. It was more like a trauma reaction of the physical earth. So it was not scripted as precisely or at all compared to where they put the sacred sites. See the difference there? So sometimes the mountain rose up where the light temple was, and sometimes just a little bit to the side.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it really is interesting when you talk about, how the physical can interact with the astral, or rather, the astral interacts with the physical, and so like by destabilizing the grid, the trauma was felt on the earth, and the physical evidence of that is the tilt and the mountains, and etc. And I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
In Western mythology, all of that disturbance is represented in the myth of the wounded Fisher King. Most people have heard of the Grail and the Grail Castle, and maybe the Fisher King. It's sort of a Western myth. It's a very profound one. Originally, the Fisher King was like a person possessing complete awareness of the timeline of humanity, of his own soul, and of the earth. In other words, how did we get here, and when did it start, and it's like having a complete encyclopedic history of the soul. And it was not really a gender thing. It wasn't like a guy. But the point was, the rich, they call him a rich Fisher King because he was rich in that total memory. And then with the perturbation of the earth, he became the wounded Fisher King, and he had amnesia. It's a way of representing the state of the human soul. Although there actually is, if you go to a Grail Castle on a psychic level, there is a Fisher King. And you can see in both forms, wounded and rich. All these myths are actually real. It's just they're psychically real. And so the wound, everyone participates in that. People do not remember their own timeline. Sure, you remember, let's say you're 50 years old or 60 years old. You remember most of your personal history. But what about the 10,000 lives you had before this one, leading to the present moment? Or as Laurel and Hardy, the Oliver Hardy, the large guy, would say to the skinny guy, well, this is another fine mess you got us into. That's like the current incarnated person talking to the soul or the past life continuum. Look at all this total mess you guys got me into. And so the wounded Fisher King is the part of us, and also the global collective of humanity, that cannot remember its own history. It's got permanent amnesia. Well, not permanent, but prolonged, because it is reversible. Anyway, that's a way of explaining the aftermath of that massive disturbance of the planet in terms of myth.
Yeah, and so after the third group of humans, right? We're the fourth in this framework. We're the fourth, and obviously we're not a psychic. We don't have cities. We don't have, at least we don't have access to them as easily, right? It takes a lot of work for us to get there. And so that it seems to me, I believe you write this in the book, that was basically by design, right? In a sense, free will, and almost like the Promethean myth, the Lucifer myth, right? The idea that free will needed to be tamed. Like, we still can have free will, but it's like, because of that third group and the disaster that was, there needed to be limits. Is that an accurate statement? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. It's another profound topic. Christianity talks about original sin, right? Everyone is born and they're flawed from the beginning. Even a one-day-old infant has original sin, and they mistakenly attribute this original sin to an excess of sexual activity in the past, all the way back to Samaria, which is now today's Iraq, by the way. That isn't the case at all. The original sin was the aftermath and consequences of the abuse of those psychic powers of the chakras. It's a complicated subject, but it brings in Pandora's box, for example. Pandora was a name for the entire demographic collective. It was not a woman who screwed up. Then can't go that way. You won't get the correct understanding. It's a generic demographic term, Pandora. The same with Lilith. The Pandora's box is the psychic, the misuse of the psychic powers, and the doors that it opened in the trashier levels of the astral plane invited an entire pathogenic invasion of the generic human form. It let all kinds of nasty stuff into the human form, thereby creating pathologies, dysfunctions, and illnesses, and leading in mortal illnesses, cancer and the rest. And the box is a way of referring to the human generic and genetic and phylogenic design. In other words, not you, not me, the complete blueprint for a human. That's the box. And it got exposed to pathogenic influence, but I mean psychically pathogenic, that then led to actual physical pathologies, reduced longevity, heightened mortality, and in our current time, fairly nasty ways to die. I mean, nasty types of diseases that just take the body apart. That was all a consequence of that original perturbation. So Pandora's box is actually yet another memory of that.
Very interesting. And so we're kind of living that. And you mentioned about, you know, the idea of the Djinn, you know, as they are representation, or they are the spirits, or so to speak, of the original or that third group, and they cannot incarnate as human until we forgive them, right? Until we've forgiven that original sin, so to speak.
That's almost it. The Djinn, I have to spell this, is D-J-I-N-N. It's not the alcoholic J-I-N, the G-I-N. It's an Arabic name that refers to spirits of fire and smoke. It's prevalent in the Arab countries, you know, what we call the Middle East. The story goes, well, okay, what happened is when humanity was removed from the planet, the caretakers, superintendents, and co-signers of the loan of free will, known as Lucifer and Sophia, who, by the way, were not expressions of Satan or the Antichrist. They're separate beings. They were actually our benefactors. They had to take the hit. The loan got defaulted. Human free will got abused. Their sponsors and superintendents had to voluntarily suffer a diminishment on the earth. They got bound. The story of Prometheus being bound on Mount Caucasus by Zeus, that's a picture of Lucifer and Sophia being bound after that demise of the generation. The Djinn is a way of referring to what happened to all those drowned people. They are not ever going to be allowed to incarnate again. It's too grievous an offense, apparently. But they were apportioned by some mathematical mean, I mean, in terms of groups, like 10,000 here, 10,000 there, whatever, to be in the same domiciles as where Lucifer and Sophia were bound, and to have a fairly miserable lifetime until such time as currently incarnated humans actively forgave them for creating original sin, for creating conditions that led to the limitations of the power of consciousness, so that our phylogenic version of humanity entered incarnation with limitations. Not permanent ones, they can all be overcome, but it's sort of like you're used to riding a bicycle with just the two wheels, and then you screwed up and they put training wheels back on it, and they took off some of the gears, so they only had one gear instead of 10 gears. A little bit like that. The light grid was redesigned somewhat, and limitations were put in to prevent that abuse again. Anyway, so the Djinn are locked away with multiple copies of Lucifer and Sophia. There's actually over 3,000 of those light temples. They used to be light temples, then they became prisons. So as periodically and under divine guidance, in other words, by invitation, Grail Knights or Geomancers participate in the unbinding of Lucifer and Sophia at specific sites and forgiving the Djinn who are bound with them. The cool thing is, the Djinn become hierophants of the Lords of Light. They actually get a major promotion. They can't incarnate, but they're no longer in a state of being reviled by incarnate humans. Now, unfortunately, this whole thing is a very esoteric matter, because the three religions of Abraham, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, have done such a marvelous job in demonizing Lucifer and Sophia that nobody even approaches the subject, because they assume we're talking about Satan and the Antichrist. Which, by the way, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast with you, that was the most brilliantly successful disinformation campaign ever conducted on the earth, to convince people that Lucifer and Sophia were the Antichrist. Not only that, Sophia hardly gets any mention at all. She's like an out-of-work goddess. In other words, people don't realize according to this principle of masculine and feminine, that even Lucifer has a feminine counterpart. That's Sophia. The two together comprise the two primary lords of light. Anyway, so as humanity selectively forgives the Djinn for their misuse of the psychic powers leading to Pandora's box and all the rest of it, they get liberated. They get to take on their next role as Hierophants, which is not a bad job. They can't incarnate, but they're no longer in the slammer, in the lockup.
So where does the myth of the Djinn as genie come from? Like the idea of granting 3 wishes and that.
I know. Well, there you have a case of the degeneration of a mythic reality. It's similar to Scandinavian trolls. You've heard trolls? I've seen trolls. They're just basically big gnomes. They're not bad. They're not scary. They're not ill-behaved. They're just large. They're like large teenagers instead of small teenagers. So large versions of gnomes. Gnomes are like 3 feet tall. The trolls are 5 feet tall. So the cultural picture of trolls in Scandinavia, even if you read the plays of Ibsen, like The Master Builder, he has his character saying about 10 times, "Oh, I hope my troll nature doesn't take me over and make me into a monster." All right, so the same thing has happened with the Djinn and the genies. In some cases, let's say black magicians have commandeered some of these Djinn and forced them to be what they call in magic familiars. In other words, the go-fors. Do this for me, manifest this for me. Yet even that has been exaggerated. The genie's 3 wishes, it's basically like a cartoon extrapolation that is so far away from the actual reality that it's inconsequential. But that happens with some of the myths, is that they get appropriated, exaggerated, distorted, and eventually misunderstood, like the trolls or the genies granting wishes.
Yeah, that's such an interesting metaphor, because I'm thinking of Aladdin, the Disney movie, right, where it's very Hollywood, very Disney, right? But it's the idea of like the lamp, they rub the lamp, the genie comes out. You're freeing the human is freeing, or releasing the spirit, so to speak, right? Forgiving, right? I guess you could see that.
It's more like appropriating.
Well, in the case of black magicians, and things like that. But I guess in terms of the story, the Arabian Nights story, right? About taking the genie and releasing it, right?
Consider this. I mentioned that generation of humanity having access to all the occult powers of the chakras and abusing them. Well, let's say there they are in prison in these lockdown light temples, yet they still have the knowledge of how to use those occult powers. And technically those occult powers would be unlimited access to all the wishes that a genie could grant per the fairy tale version of it. So if you're a certain caste of mind and you have certain magical protocols, you can force one of those jinns to apply some of their cities or occult powers to manifest things for you. And those the myth of the genie and the lamp and everything could have come from that. It's not a good idea because you're basically generating bad karma for yourself, which you'll have to deal with at some point. But that is a way of accounting for how the Djinn could actually act like the genie granting wishes, because they still had the power. Those occult powers could shape all aspects of reality. Just take all the images from the X-Men and the Superman type movies and put them all together and imagine yourself having those powers. That's what first generation humanity had. Not every last person, but a significant amount of people, enough to destabilize the planet, to create anything you want, just like the wishes of a genie. The trouble is they lacked the maturity. They created things out of selfishness and power and domination, and not for the benefit of others or the planet. Hence, everything went bad.
Yeah, that seems to be a pattern that even we today in our generation of humanity, so to speak, we continuously enact and reenact, right? There's been plenty of empires have come and gone, fallen. The creation of nuclear power, right, is a type of Pandora's box. Nuclear weapons, the potential to destroy humanity again with these weapons is very real. And it's actually very interesting that when the first nuclear tests were happening, UFOs started to appear more, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that's, ultra terrestrials, right, coming in and checking in on things and making sure that we're not up to, potentially going to destroy ourselves, like we have in the past so many times. So it's very interesting. The story of Atlantis is also related to that, I think. And you mentioned a lot in your book about Maldek, right? I know we talked about last time. You mentioned it was geomancers abusing their grid, which resulted in their planet exploding, right? And do you want to kind of touch on that a little bit and kind of, because I think that's interesting. It's an interesting myth because it touches on the dangers of messing with the light grid when you don't know what you're doing, and also you mentioned that the reason the geomancers were interested in let's say hacking their light grid was to speed things up. Do you kind of want to touch on that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Well, to start with, Maldek is one name among many to describe what is now the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And it's a guy from a few centuries ago worked out a mathematical theory, a formula accounting for the necessary placement of planets in the galaxy, and said there's one missing. Maldek is a name for the one that's missing. The asteroid belt is what's left of when the planet blew up. Okay, that's the outer story. I should say my recollection of the place, not what I read in books, but I actually remembered it, was the geomancers, the ones who maintained the light grid and its interaction with the physical world, got seduced. On that planet, the light grid the light grid of consciousness worked closely with the energy power grid, which is based on hydrogen. They put the power plants in the same place as the sacred sites, which occasionally you find on the planet today, but not consistently. And the resident geomancers were Pleiadians because they were the master designers for most planets and light grids. They designed most of the nests of light. That's their job. They're good at it. They got bored. It was slow. It was sort of like, if I could say this without insulting anyone, it's like, I remember when I was in 7th grade and when I had to go to school, they put me in the wrong class. I was a fairly bright person, articulate and whatever. They put me in a class of really slow, dull students. I thought, what am I doing in this class? They got bored. They got bored and slow, and I was too young to say I was in the wrong class. Well, let's say you're a geomancer. You're on a planet where evolution is moving very slowly, and it's hard to put it graciously, but you just considered that the people you were superintending were bovine. They just were going to take forever to come to what was intended. Now, that really was an inappropriate attitude to have, but nonetheless, they were bored. And they got seduced by, let's say, aliens from another planet, intelligent life forms from a different planet that wanted to take advantage of the situation. They said, look, how about if we move the planet to a faster neighborhood, like moving zip codes, so to speak, and we can get the planet to revolve faster, and the evolutionary process will happen more briskly, and you won't be bored. And they sort of planted this idea for a while and showed them how to do it, and even began to do it. The trouble is, it all backfired, and the planet blew up. It's hard to explain the energy mechanism of it, but the energy sort of imploded. They didn't move the planet, it didn't get faster, it actually destroyed the planet. And this left all of the souls, the human souls on Maldek without a planet. It's like coming back from work and you find your house burned down and all that's left is ashes. You got no place to live. So Earth had to be prepared as a replacement planet. It had to be outfitted rather quickly. Now that's not going to happen by the accidents of collisions of particles and all the rest of it. They needed another planet in a hurry. I mean, it might have taken 1 million years, but not billions to get the Earth ready for all these disincarnate souls from Maldek. Anyway, so it's a classic case of being bored, of things just moving too slowly. And the trouble is, I often wonder regarding the angelic realm. I know they're not human. They don't have chakras. They don't have emotions. They don't regard things the way we do. They're totally neutral and totally enlightened all the time. Yet, the slowness of evolution on the planet must occasionally, at least in an abstract, hypothetical sense, strike them as a little bit boring. It's just taking forever for this to happen. I'm just speculating. I don't want to insult any angelic order by saying they're capable of being bored, but I sometimes wonder. The thing is, you actually can't speed it up. You can't even intervene because free will is an absolutely exacting law. The most you can do is occasionally nudge or make a suggestion. You cannot go in there and directly intervene. And even the bad guys can't do that. The demonic realm, the hostile aliens, they can't directly intervene. They can. It's like in espionage. You can put out disinformation, misinformation. You can plant spies. You can nudge things. You could dirty wells, so to speak, muddy the waters. But you can't actually commandeer somebody and take them over and force them to act against their free will. So the whole planet was designed with that caveat, which means it can only, the evolutionary process can only proceed at that rate. On the other hand, almost contradicting that, beginning in January 2020, two things happened. COVID and the beginning of the Golden Age, Satya Yuga, the age of truth, according to the Hindu time model. And the two things were at war with each other for a while, although COVID lost and the Satya Yuga is winning because it's a 1.7 million year cycle. But the point is, that was a case of the Supreme Being saying, I know I said we can't intervene, but this timepiece, this time clock of the universe is absolute, even though I invented it. And this is now the period of truth and light, and things are going to proceed faster. It's like setting a metronome at a faster pace than it used to be. Or if you're a jogger, your coach telling you have to run a little, like 10% faster. Now, normally a Supreme Being would not issue any directives like that, but this is more like a cosmic necessity. The speed of the universe is speeded up. That's what the Hindu time model was talking about. Periods of great enlightenment, period of complete darkness. And so things have speeded up, and people are coping or failing to cope with the increased pace. It's not an impossible pace, 10, 15% increase perhaps, enough that a person could match it if they applied themselves a little bit. If they don't apply themselves, certain symptoms and patterns of behavior will start emerging, sort of disorientation, derangement, futility, frustration, anger, confusion. It's a big change going on. You sort of have to try to match it a bit because it's inexorable. And it's going to be the case for 1.7 million years, whether you like it or not. So that's a case where a Supreme Being sort of contradicted his own rules out of this larger picture of time.
Yeah, and going back to dark forces hacking the grid, right, or subtly influencing. You mentioned espionage, the kind of like subtlety of that. One of the fascinating stories in your book is I'm going to mispronounce the name, but Kartikeya, and their story of working with the planet that's near the center of the galaxy, and how it was a great metaphor. It was a great story because it really kind of showcased the issue with dark force, dark influences, and how it can really cause damage to an entire planet. So do you want to kind of speak on that a little bit?
Well, Kartikeya is one name among many that refers to what we would call a Pleiadian warrior or kind of 5-star general. Not so much a god of war, but more like a god of transmutation. In other words, enforcing the law and order of the universe against entropy and deliberate destruction. But let me talk about these alien forces. There's a story from the Mahabharata. That's a very large epic from India. It means Great India, Mahabharata. And in that story, Garuda, which is an eagle form of the Ofanim, was asked by Brahma, another name for the Supreme Being, to go into the house of gods and collect the soma and take it out of the house of gods and bring it back for humanity. Actually, in the story, it says he has to break in and do a stealth deal where he steals it and then it's to save his mother. But that's storytelling. It's not quite the actual truth. Garuda took the vat of soma from the house of the gods. Now, that's code. What it means is, first, what's soma? Soma, in terms of conventional mythology, means the elixir of immortality. You drink a soma, your body lives forever. That's not what it is. Soma is the collected consciousness of the 40 angelic orders in their pure, unfallen, undifferentiated state. It's an immortality of consciousness, not the body. And that's what an angel is. It's never descended into the chakra realm of humans and incarnation, except with a few exceptions. So to steal the soma really means Supreme Being said to the Ofanim, because they're in charge of consciousness, we are going to install this soma, the quality of the 40 angelic families and their awareness, into the human form. We're going to give it to humans. And the story presents it as if Garuda went in there and it's a big bar fight and everything got trashed and tables overturned and bottles broken, just like you'd see in movies. And all the gods were outraged and annoyed. It would be a bit like if you're an English aristocrat in the House of Lords and the East Enders just got an audience with the Queen and King. I mean, back in Victorian days when it actually meant something. And it struck them as a flagrant abuse of their privileged position. In other words, about a third of the alien intelligences in the galaxies, it's quite a population of different types, were outraged that the Supreme Being was going to give this brand new phylogeny, this called humanity, the full spectrum of awareness of the gods that they had enjoyed in a privileged position. And now these upstart humans are going to have the same thing. Granted, they would have to develop it and access it, but all the humans were given the soma, the immortality of consciousness. And this outraged a lot of the alien intelligences. They have been full of resentment against the Supreme Being ever since. And they have, in various ways, sought to subvert, prevent, block, destroy, misdirect, disorient human evolution ever since. Think of it like this. There's a sporting match in traditional sporting match in England called a cricket game, which is sort of a demented form of baseball. a cricket game between two posh schools, Eton and Harrow. They're like posh private schools. And it's at Lord's Cricket Ground in London. And I don't know if they still do this, but if you read the Forsyth saga from like 1910, it was a big social event, right? So everybody would go there. And if you sort of take that example and put it at the cosmic level, you've got a spectrum within the viewers. Let's say a third of them want to fix the game. They want it to come out their way. 1/3 at the other spectrum is happy to see how it comes out. The group in the middle is neutral. So you have one group that is sort of helping humanity evolve, one group is neutral, and one group is totally against humanity waking up and will do anything possible to subvert it. That's been going on for as long as humans have existed. And it plays out across the spectrum. It corrupts the light grid, creating a kind of aberration called the dark grid, just like the dark internet. That's sort of an aberration of the original internet. May even be bigger than that. So the dark grid is like a deliberately contaminated version of the light grid. And it subtly misdirects people, or it fills them with a sense of futility or confusion or misperception or illusion, sort of like like having opioids on a drip feed into your consciousness. And it's not a happy opium dream. It's all nightmares. Anyway, that's been going on forever. And part of the work of the Grail Knights or Geomancers is to undo it, because otherwise it bleeds right into daytime consciousness and the body, politics, sociology, world conditions, weather, leading to a planet that's not pleasant to live on, which has been the experience of our generation. We were at the very end of the darkest age, the Kali Yuga, until 2020, in which the dark grid has maximum scope for malicious influence. And I mentioned this term malefic astrology. It's actually a traditional term in astrology. If you ask them about that, they say, yeah, we know about that. It's when some of the larger planets, let's say Saturn and Pluto, well, Pluto's not large, but it's very powerful, have unfavorable geometric relations, configurations, they square or conjunct. There's a whole language for it. And these create temporary nasty conditions for consciousness. When the whole COVID thing was released, it was expertly timed to coincide with the worst configuration of Saturn and Pluto in centuries for maximum effect. They weaponized that malefic astrology to accomplish a temporary police state on the planet. Everybody was locked down. Everybody had the vaccine. Everybody's going to die from COVID, all that nonsense for 3 years. And then the planets moved out of alignment and they lost all their power because it just wasn't there to support them. So that thing is, when you're talking about the dark grid and dark influences or deep state, secret government, shadow government, you have to think in terms of layers or laminations. It's layers and layers and layers and layers. And ultimately you get out to the more sophisticated dark aliens that are actually the true puppet masters, and what you might think represents the deep state, like the people who meet at Davos and plan the world. So they're the puppets, they're the hand puppets. So you have to always think in terms of layers. But on a practical level, a lot of the geomantic work in recent years has been to undo their power base in the light grid. You can't undo it in the physical world. You have to undo it in the, so to speak, the magical world, where it has maximum traction. Sort of pull out all the electrical plugs where they can keep sending in this current of darkness. And then eventually the physical world adjusts. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. And that's fascinating. And that's like the, where the real work happens, right? Where the most effective thing can happen. It's not, and that's why people, there's a lot of people who think, well, what can I do to help? And it's like, and I always say, well, first off, if you unblock your own energy center, if you work on yourself in terms of like unblocking the heart, right, and working through the things that are in you, you help the planet, right, and by working on yourself in that way, it spreads out to everything, and then I guess in a sense, working in the light grid, right, in a more advanced work of that is kind of a similar metaphor, so to speak.
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah. It's even better than that, because if you work with the light grid, as I said, and try to pull out some of these dark electrical cords, this is just an analogy, inevitably you will encounter equivalent darkness in yourself, and you will have to deal with that at the same time. If you don't deal with that, you're going to get sick. So the two go together. So you actually get 2 for 1. You work on the planet for the benefit of all humanity, it will necessarily have an impact on you, requiring you to pull out some electrical cords from your own space. Now, the thing is, you have to be patient, because one of the incontrovertible facts that a person trained in clairvoyance has to accept is that everyone has had multiple lifetimes, hundreds, thousands, and with lots of unresolved issues. These unresolved issues accumulate in the various chakras according to the theme. Chakras have different themes, you might say. And it could take a lifetime to clean out just one chakra because you're cleaning out the detritus of 10,000 lifetimes. It isn't something you get done in a weekend. It's a slow process. On the other hand, if you make a certain amount of progress on that, I don't know what percent, 20%, 30%, everything gets easier. You're still going to have to be vigilant about things that get aggravated or illuminated in your personal space as you interact with the light grid. But you just sort of take it in stride and deal with it. This is another reason why it's necessary to have clairvoyance, because you need to be able to see these, to use the analogy again, these dark electrical cords. Otherwise, how are you going to pull them out? You can't even see them. Where are they? And it's quite shocking. In one of my earlier books, I documented some of the things we encountered in cleaning out certain types of light tunnels. It was quite appalling. I mean, if you read any of H.P. Lovecraft, it's even scarier than that. It's just everything from the mythology of the demonic realm is right there in your face, and you have to deal with it. On the other hand, your training equips you to deal with it, so it's no big deal. But the appalling part is to see how contaminated most sacred sites have become because no one's been maintaining them. Just to go to a place and pray and prostrate doesn't, no offense, doesn't actually change the light grid aspect of the place. You actually have to get in there and do a professional cleanup. And to do that, you have to have the right tools and you have to be able to see what you're doing.
Yeah, it almost, we've all been to places where, the energy just feels bad, right? Or dark or whatever. Like if you go to for example, areas that are considered haunted, right? A lot of the issue with that is because a lot of energy has been expanded, emotional energy, right? So a place, for example, where a murder may have happened, right? So a lot of negative energy has imbued the space with this fear, right? In this intense energy, and that can lead to hauntings and things like that. And it sounds like that's similar when it comes to the light grid, right? In that sense, there's like this negative energy just sticks to these areas and these places that have been built up over, thousands of years.
Well, how should I say, professionally speaking, dealing with ghosts and ill-behaved dead people is really the easiest part. Haunting of houses, you can deal with that in 10 minutes. It's more, that sort of, people die under trauma and they don't leave the physical world properly and they get stuck here, they want payback, whatever. That's easily dealt with. I'm referring to something more complex and nasty than that and more deliberate, almost like laminating sites with layers of dark energy, nasty spirit birds and astral octopuses and armies of demons and black cords going to God knows where. I mean, a much more deliberate process of making a site nasty and dark and full of ill will, and you're not going to want to be there. Or if you are there, you may end up getting covered in that same nasty energy and not realize it, and you go out and project it into the world. So it's actually much worse than just haunted places. They're easy to deal with.
Interesting. Well, so I kind of want to go into the astrology part a little bit more. So in the book, you mention, you several times, reference that the Pleiadians were working with the planet and it was annoying to them. The influence of the outer planets was almost like an annoyance. Like it wasn't affecting them because they're not from here, but it was an annoyance to their work. And so I thought that really fascinating. And you also mentioned that, and it seemed to me that the number of planets that our system has is a little bit unusual, and that it may have a direct effect in terms of the level of quote unquote difficulty that we seem to have in terms of our, not development, but in terms of the ebbs and flows that we all go through in our life, right? It seems like a lot of times people are pushed to and fro by the forces that they can't control or see, and that may be an unusual thing in the universe. Is that something that is an accurate statement?
Well, here's two whimsical ways of looking at it. Let's say you grew up in a large family of 10 children and you're living in a very small house. Everyone's going to get in everyone else's way and get in everyone's face. And eventually everyone's going to be irritated. Or there's an image from one of the Three Stooges movies where the Three Stooges are all sleeping in the same bed and the bed is only big enough for one person. And the minute one of the Stooges moves, it knocks the other two on the floor, or it wakes them up, or they get an elbow in the side. So these are my whimsical analogies for the astrological situation of having a solar system with a lot of planets instead of one planet or two planets. It's like a large family. Now, the way you have to understand this is that when a person is born, their horoscope begins. That is actually a light grid map of the starting influence of all the planets in the given solar system. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe in astrology or not, it's a fact. It's like a photograph taken or a fingerprint. And then because there are so many planets and they're constantly doing stuff, and most of the planets actually have a much worse tilt than the Earth, by the way, which means all of them, well, this isn't why they go retrograde, but if you talk to an astrologer every year, most of the planets are going retrograde, and Mercury goes retrograde 3 times a year, like somebody with Alzheimer's walking backwards for 3 weeks, 3 times a year. Anyway, that's only from the perspective of the Earth. But because there's so many planets, your personal horoscope, which again is like a fourth dimensional light grid that you're walking inside, is constantly affected by all these nuances of differing and changing configurations. So it's like your emotional body and your mental body and your physical body, to an extent, is constantly having to react, respond, and modulate these incoming influences. If you had a solar system with just a few planets, I speculate there'd be less stress along those lines. So when I say the Pleiadians got annoyed, it's more like I get annoyed because I think I'd rather have a family that had only a few members instead of a lot of members. In other words, a solar system with just a few. Because sometimes, even though you can't do anything about it, and it's sort of the mechanism of a solar system with multiple planets, it does tend to keep throwing you off balance, because the changing configurations of the actual planets affects your horoscope in unique ways. It would affect me in different ways than you because we have different horoscope. And you're constantly having to adjust to these influences. And sometimes it's just a nuisance from my point of view. Sometimes I consider the planets a nuisance because I'm sick of having my consciousness constantly modulated and nudged and kicked and squeezed and pressured and all the rest of that, even though I know it's an unavoidable consequence and cost of doing business on planet Earth, which is in a solar system with multiple planets. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
No, yeah, it's interesting. Like the Hermetic in Hermes' work, he talks about the 7 rings, right? Obviously, we have more than 7 planets, but when it was written, that was the idea. And when you die, you go through the 7 rings. You give back the essence of that planet, right? So you give back to the sun. You give back, which is not a planet, but they considered it a planet in astrology, ancient astrology. You give back, ambition, right? And you give back these different things until finally you become light enough that you can move beyond the gate of Saturn, so to speak, into the higher realms. And that's really interesting, to think about astrology in that way is like, it's almost like we're trying to break the bounds of gravity, right? To kind of free ourselves from these extra planetary influences, which is also cool because it's like, if you look in like the history, like NASA and stuff like that, it's like the space program. It's like where humanity's like people say, like, our destination, our destinies in the stars, right? So it's to leave the Earth, so to speak, and to kind of venture out. And I kind of disagree with that in a lot of ways, especially the whole push to live on Mars and whatnot. I think it's ridiculous, but it is cool to think about from a sci-fi perspective and tying that to a Hermetic perspective, this idea of the evolution of man, is, to become a intergalactic, species, so to speak.
That's the design of the human being. You don't have to go anywhere. It's all here. The galaxy is on the Earth. The light grid is a circus or a museum or a Disneyland of all the prime and relevant features of the galaxy and the celestial and spiritual world that are pertinent to the human being. They're all part of every human being by design, as well as on the light grid. And that's why I somewhat, that's why I've amended the Hermetic axiom that most people have probably heard, as above, so below, to say as above, so below, and in the middle too. The as above is the celestial design. The so below is the human via the astrological model and the generic phylogenetic design of the person. The middle part is the Earth, same pattern. We have the same pattern as the Earth. We don't look the same, but we have the same kind of light grid, which is what enables us to interact with it. And both of these patterns are copies, edited copies, mind you, relevant to the nature of the planet and the design for the human, but still essentially a copy of the celestial original. So that pretty much defines, how should I say, how to go about living on the Earth, realizing that you're part of that large picture. I wrote a book a few years ago called Walking in Albion. Albion is like a name for that above pattern, which is copied on the Earth. And so walking in Albion means you live with more or less a constant awareness of being part of that large design and having the same design as the planet. And both you and the planet having the same design as the galaxy, or at least partially the same as the galaxy. And so walking in Albion means you live in an awareness of that. And that awareness in itself contributes to the awakening of the Albion figure so that other people would find it easier to come to the same interpretation. I mean, that's sort of the design plan, as I understand it.
Yeah. So maybe we go touch on Albion, because that's a massive topic, and it's very interesting. In the law of one, and a lot of my audiences, people who watch this are familiar with the law of one, and we spoke about that before. But there's a concept called the social memory complex, which is when a whole society kind of locks into the same polarity, right? And the minds form a single transparent group consciousness. And it seems like the concept of Albion relates to that in a sense, right? It's where a planet awakens, right? Where each member of that planet intelligence has essentially become a group mind. Right? Is that an accurate kind of definition of that?
Heading in the right direction. I would say it's a little larger than that picture. Let's take a top-down view. The Kabbalistic model uses the term Adam Kadmon. It's a way of referring to one Kabbalist, Gershom Scholem, wrote, it's essentially God's idea of the perfect form. I think that's what he said. It's, for the purposes of humans, it's described as an anthropomorphic figure. Ultimately, it's not. But it is some kind of container in which the Supreme Being has put all the aspects of creation that are relevant and that are in manifest form. And the Albion is the Earth's copy of that. And it's adjusted to the specifics of the planet Earth. The way it's adjusted is, as I said before, it's Albion's generic shape. If we just take an anthropomorphic form for a moment, like picture somebody who's like a yogi and they're draped backwards over a large beach ball. That's a way of looking at Albion. In a sense, he's draped over part of the Earth. And when I say he, it's not really a masculine figure. It's just the way of referring to it. And his generic anatomical form consists of a copy of the main features of the Earth's light grid. And then ever since humanity began, all of the experiences are archived in this Albion. And let me go sideways for a moment to the model put forward by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who arrived at the notion of Albion through geology, of all things. He said the world mind was the noosphere. That's a Greek word, nous, or however you say it, for the mind. Okay, that's the first level where everyone realizes they are living in Albion. And then he said the pivotal event in that is the omega point or the omega moment or something. And that's when this figure is completely suffused with the Christ essence. Again, not the Christianity Christ, but as a cosmic fact, the Logos. In other words, one step down from the Supreme Being. Okay, we're not talking about the Christian Christ in that sense. Well, Albion is sort of the same idea. It's not so much sharing in a group mind. It's more like realizing that you are already cosmic-sized. That's a term Eliade used to use. It's like your consciousness has been rendered to a cosmic level of interpretation. In other words, you realize you're bigger than just a human being. You've got the solar system, the galaxy, and multiple galaxies, plus the mind of the Supreme Being. That's to say you are cosmic-sized. So when enough people have that same experience, they become, shall we say, self-aware, lucid, awake within this larger being of Albion. You need a certain percentage for that to happen. And then the Albion figure itself awakens and becomes a sentient being. The big plan is that the Albion is meant to be Earth's ambassador to a larger congregation of Albions from other planets. Now, there's this layers and layers of planning. We're barely at the first layer. So the Albion's a big deal. If you haven't read William Blake, and he's not easy to understand anyway, you may not even have heard of the term. It also used to be the name of Scotland or England itself. They used to say perfidious Albion, which meant treacherous England, but they actually weren't referring to this light being. It was just a way of describing the physical country of England. So it's still a concept that's not too well known. And it's a large picture. It's a large concept. Yet it's still part of the design of the planet. One key thing. The only way it works, you can't just get into group mind if you have not individuated first. That's a term from Carl Jung. It's a way of saying, let's say you're sitting at a round table and all of your past lives are there and your shadow is there as well. All the parts of yourself you don't know about or have rejected or suppressed or put in exile, it's all there. And you have to assimilate and accommodate it and be friends with it. That's called individuation. You sort of master all the particulars of your horoscope, the 12 signs of the zodiac and past life issues, you resolve them. That's individuation. Then you're ready for a group mind experience. That's actually the experience of the Holy Grail. So the Albion requires that first people have this individuation experience, then they can participate in this collective shared consciousness. You can't skip over the first stage and just go to group mind. You'll lose your way. It won't happen. It won't work. So I wanted to make that point. That a certain amount of preparation is involved. And that preparation, as you referred to earlier when you're talking about purifying your heart chakra and some of the other chakras, is you actually have to do a fair amount of house cleaning in your own subjective psychic space so that you could potentially participate in that. And here's the paradox also. Yes, everyone has free will, but it's a bit like having a credit card that you've almost maxed out. You have very little credit left on your credit card. That's free will because you've already used it. You've created unresolved karma, actions that require consequence. Either you have to pay someone back or they're going to pay you back. Your credit card is almost maxed out. So yes, you have free will, but you have very little left of it to use until you've done some processing. Now, here's another problem. And this is where I have a little bit of an animus against Christianity because they've grievously misled people into thinking that Jesus is going to forgive your sins, which means pay off your credit card debt. He's not. He's going to forgive you for being such a complete idiot to have created the sins. You still have to pay off the debts. That's the Buddhist notion of karma. So if you don't even have that as a working metaphysical model, you are never going to get free of this. You're not going to be able to participate in the Albion group mind because you are burdened by the immense accumulation of your own karma from multiple lifetimes, and you're burdened by ignorance of that in the first place because those religions have disavowed the reality of it. You see how complicated that is? So
yeah, and I love that analogy of credit card. The credit card analogy is just like you know, really clarified the idea of karma. You know, it's an extremely brilliant analogy. You know, it's like the more we all can have unlimited credit, but the more you use it, or sorry, we don't have unlimited credit, but the more you use a credit card, the more in debt you are, right? So that I think that's a fascinating analogy.
Clarify though, it's both kinds. There's good karma and bad karma, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Bad karma would be an action against another person's free will and the possibility of the Christ light arising in them. In other words, you've deliberately done something nasty to them. You could say that's bad karma. They are going to expect you to make good on it in a future life. You have to make recompense. The other side of that is, let's say you did something wonderful to a person. You introduced them to a living saint and they touched your forehead and you had a revelation of the hierarchy of the galaxy. And it was wonderful and it totally changed your life. You might want to pay them back the favor. But in either case, if you're intent on either revenge or positive payback, it requires you to incarnate again. And it's like using your credit card again. And it just, the Buddhists have a model for this. They call it the Baba Chakra. It's a big wheel. They show this really scary being with his head on the top and his arms with long fingers on the side and this huge wheel. They call it the wheel of life. You constantly incarnate, die, create karma, pay off karma, reincarnate to collect karma owed you. You just don't get off it. That's the part of the Buddhist model. So all of that tends to diminish the fluidity of actual free will. And if you want to participate in the light grid, you actually have to free yourself from many layers of disinformation and what I like to call narrative walls. Imagine you have a copy of the Berlin Wall in your consciousness telling you certain interpretations of reality. It's all matter. It's a machine. Your body is a stupid piece of flesh and chemistry with no consciousness, or consciousness is a byproduct of the body, or whatever. You have to get past these false narrative walls to have enough freedom and consciousness to engage in the light grid, because that narrative wall, again, like a Berlin Wall in your consciousness, says such things don't even exist. See, there's a lot of roadblocks. And that's the epitome of the Kali Yuga, which we just left. It's that they had 432,000 years to create endless narrative walls that disempowered people. It's really quite it's really a perennial conflict. But because it's now the Satya Yuga, how should I say, if we were hobbits and this was the battle against Sauron, we just destroyed his ring.
So yes, you mentioned that the last 5 years has been an initiation test for humanity, right? And this is the first 5 years of the new Satya Yuga, and we're still ongoing. So you seem to claim that we've already won, right? Or at least the good side, so to speak, has already won the battle, or the war rather. Yeah.
The conflict will continue. But as I just used the analogy from Lord of the Rings, they just dumped the ring in the volcano and his time is up. Now, let me give you an example. The 5 years is not a fixed number. It's just that's where we are now. It could take 10 years or 20 years. But what's been happening is this kind of cosmic timepiece that goes through these 4 major periods of time. Overall, the full cycle is like 4 million years. And they each have a quality. The Greeks call them the Golden Age, the Bronze Age, the Silver Age, and the Iron Age. The Hindus had their own name for them. The Age of Truth is the best one. Well, what happens is, to fully manifest the Age of Truth, you have to dredge out all the lies that came from the Age of Darkness. And that's what's been happening the last 5 years. It'll probably go on another 20 years, is the more light you liberate and introduce into the original light grid pattern, it is going to precipitate all the darkness and nastiness that's been buried in the light grid and in human consciousness. It's going to bring it to the surface, just like if you ever do a detoxification protocol for colon and liver using herbs. There are days when you feel absolutely miserable because your liver is tasting again the poisonous crap you put in your body. And there's no way around it. It's temporary, but it's not pleasant. the same thing is happening on the planet. It's a detoxification process. And yes, it's a challenge to everyone because there is no way out of it unless you want to die. Well, you can do that. But if you're staying, you have to be willing to deal with the garbage that is being squeezed out of your consciousness and even out of your cells at the same time it's being squeezed out of the world, politics, sociology, the landscape, cultures, religion, education. It's coming out everywhere. There's no way around it. It's all in there. It has to be precipitated out, squeezed out, and then it can be transmuted, which means the dark energy is separated from the light energy. So you get the benefit of the light energy. The dark energy gets dissolved. It's not a pleasant process, but there's no way around it. It can't be stopped. It's a necessary thing. It's not pleasant. On the other hand, there are moments of epiphany, of disclosure, of hierophantic delight, you might say, when you begin to say, oh, wow, look at that. I never conceived that possible. Last 5 years, I've been working with the Ofanim very intently with the light grid, and they've shown me stuff that I couldn't even have imagined in the first 35 years I worked with them. It's been over 40 years now. And it's probably because I'm probably less of a hobbit than I used to be. My clairvoyance is stronger. They're willing to show more things. And the Satya Yuga or Golden Age makes it easier to show those things. If you're living in the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, which you and me and everybody who's a baby boomer, plus our parents and everyone else was brought up under, it is hard even to conceive of what a planet under the conditions of the Golden Age would be like. It's impossible to see it, but even to imagine what it might be like, I found that difficult until 2020 when it started to shift. And I'm sure I only have a little glimmer of the full spectrum. So it's a massive thing going on the planet. And the COVID thing was a temporary, totally dark grid inspired weaponization, astrological weaponization of malefic astrology to accomplish what turned out to be short-term goals. To stop that, because the Satya Yuga implicitly empowers people. It says, no, you're created with soma, with all the powers of the gods, with access to all the gods. You're not a stupid idiot human living on a inconsequential planet. That's not the case at all. That's dangerous if you're part of the authority structure or the total spectrum of what they call the deep state, not just some idiots at Davos planning economic this and that. I mean, the layers and layers and layers, all the puppet masters out to the bad aliens. This is a massive threat to their control over the planet. Because here's something most people don't realize. The Ofanim told me once that out of the approximate 18 billion galaxies that they service, and that number may not be accurate because I had to calculate it based on some bizarre way they told me to figure it out. There are only 6 planets out of 18 billion galaxies that have a unique, highly potentized, super sophisticated light grid and the possibility of total freedom and free will. And Earth is one of those 6. Only 6 out of 18 billion galaxies. Earth is one of those. Therefore, how it plays out on Earth has consequences for all of the galaxies. Therefore, if you don't like that idea and you're still mad at God for giving humans that power of consciousness, you're going to try to block it. And then it's just a layer of interlocking puppet masters, all the way down to the political level where you could actually point to people and have their names. But that's the outermost level, just layers and layers of puppet masters in accordance with that grievance against God for giving humans that much freedom and a planet with a light grid to match it.
Yeah.
It's a conflict that's been going on since humans were created.
Sure. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, that explains all the attention that Earth is getting, right? You know, and all the activity that's happening. That kind of brings me to another point you mentioned about, blaze babies is what you called them. And, to me, that it sounded a little bit like in some circles, they talk about hybrid ETs, right? The combination of some, and that's more of a negative thing, right? The idea that, certain factions are trying to create aliens that could walk among us, so to speak. And so, but in your book, you mentioned blaze babies, and it's like you talk about the Ofanim incarnating onto Earth. And so I guess if you can kind of clarify that a bit and talk about that concept.
This is, I don't like using the word amazing, but that word does qualify. In 1984, when I first started with the Ofanim, aside from when I knew them as a child, they said, when 2020 comes around, we're going to start having some bodies and incarnating on the Earth per God's permission. And the blaze part, that was our nickname for the Ofanim, because they say we come as a blazing star. So, and in the Arthur stories, Merlin had a master that he reported to, and his name was Blaze. So we just took the name out of the literature to be consistent with it. So that's where the blaze part, and it's the French spelling, B-L-A-I-S-E. Anyway, beginning in 2020, a portion of the Ofanim, with total permission of the Supreme Being, were allowed a unique, as in one-time incarnation as humans on the Earth. The number I got was they would eventually have 432,000 copies, culminating in about another 10 years. So it would be like a 15-year period of incarnation. And there are a lot of fascinating aspects, because angels don't have karma. They don't have chakras. They don't have souls. They don't need to evolve. They're created perfect. It's a fundamental difference between human beings. They don't need to evolve. There's nothing to evolve to other than to return to God. So if they're going to come in human bodies, that means we're going to potentially see human bodies they were in the legendary Garden of Eden, totally free of karma and taint. That's a fascinating thing in itself. No diseases, no complaints, no karma. They can't have karma. You have to be in the physical world to have karma, create consequences. Second, why would they be doing this? Periodically, the Supreme Being allows an angelic order, this will be the fourth time, but the first time for the Ofanim, to temporarily incarnate among living humans for the purposes of an upgrade in both genetics and consciousness. So obviously when these blaze babies, I mean, the oldest blaze babies right now are only 6 years old. This is the 6th year since they started in January 2020. So they're still children, young children. And originally they were babies, so we call them blaze babies. The intent is to mingle among humans in a kind of almost anonymous manner. In other words, the Ofanim are not an angelic order that wants to draw a lot of attention to themselves. If you ever read any of John le Carre's spy novels with George Smiley, Smiley was the absolute best spy, but he totally wanted to be inconspicuous. He did not want to be out in the limelight. The Ofanim are like that. So they're not interested in being widely recognized as such, but their mission or commission is to insinuate a higher vibration in human consciousness from their realm. And that's a pretty bold plan. And I wrote about this in a book called My Pal Blaze in 2012. Nobody paid any attention to it. Nobody said, oh, when are the Blaze babies going to come? It's just, there's no recognition. On the other hand, I'm sure that suited the Ofanim fine because they didn't want to be recognized, partly because, I hate quoting the Bible, but there is a story in the Bible somewhere that when Jesus was born as a baby, King Herod considered that a threat, and he ordered all the babies born in the last year to be killed. So they'd eventually get Jesus. Well, maybe you don't want to know where all the blaze babies are until they're of a certain maturity or integrated into society so that they remain protected, because they are unique, and unique easily changes into freak or freakish or whatever. So anyway, they are still incarnating, often with parents who you would not expect. It's not like if you're a new age meditator and everything else, you're the ideal parent. You probably aren't. So the selection process, I understand, was quite exacting. And they're still incarnating. The first one began January 1, 2020. If you just think about it, 400,000 human angel hybrid, it's going to change the vibration of the planet. Far more than the postulated alien human hybrids. I know that was sort of made popular by the X-Files and other shows like that. I'm not totally convinced that's happening. But even if it's happening, it's like a cheap version of this more exalted plan to upgrade the human vibration by mingling two elements, the human genetic form and a pure karma-free angelic form. I mean, in that book, My Pal Blaze, I tried to imagine what that would be like. There's no precedent for it. I mean, they can't have karma, as I said. They're not going to evolve because they're already created perfect. I suppose they could create karma if they're not careful, commit actions that require consequences. But for a while, they'll be walking among people like us, you and me, our friends, emanating a unique vibration. You won't say, oh, that person feels angelic. You'll probably just say, I feel a bit uplifted. I feel rather happy, or I feel inspired, or I'm not feeling as grumpy as I used to. I mean, the effects might be more baseline like that, but it's still going to uplift things. And because that is coinciding with the advent of the golden age, it will amplify the possibility of perceiving the world or the planet in terms of its light grid complexity, whereas before it was almost impossible to see it. So,
yeah, and it kind of reminds me of the concept of wanderers that we talk about in the Law of One. They speak about how since the 1700s, gradually more, let's say, evolved souls have been incarnating into the earth from other planets or other dimensions, other higher realms. And now in our time, there's a lot more of, individuals who may not be native to Earth or who are have been on Earth but have evolved off, what do you call them, bodhisattva types, and they've come back and incarnated into the Earth in order to help uplift. And it sounds like this is more of less of the idea of individuals who've evolved from a state of lower to higher to literally they are, from the angelic realm, and they come into the earth. Now, it sounds to me like that's a very risky thing for them to do because, as we know, being in earth bodies, we are constantly inundated with the material and there's all sorts of pressures and all sorts of temptations and all sorts of problems that can happen. So to me, it sounds like a very brave thing to do, right? To come to the earth, to have the veil of forgetting put over your eyes.
Oh, that won't happen.
So you're saying in this case that wouldn't happen?
No, that
right with that
duty of awareness.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
At least in the first incarnation. I mean, if the first generation of Blaze babies create the next generation, what you're saying might be possible then. Mm-hmm. I don't know. As I said, there's no precedent for this. There's nothing to compare it to. So all we can do is wildly speculate as to likely ways it'll play out. It's a unique event.
And so when you talk about, genetics, so like, is it like incarnating? Is it like yes, I guess,
Pandora's box.
What's that?
Genetic code pre-Pandora's box, before the pathologies were introduced.
Right. I see.
Bodies.
Yeah. So, but they're incarnating in human bodies, but from presumably like they're children of humans, right? So to speak, I guess if that makes sense.
Yes, they will, as it is normally, have characteristics of both mom and dad, but what they bring to that will be unique and pure.
Is that higher in intelligence, right?
No matter how spiritual we think we are, we're still bringing a lot of crap into our next life if we have not dealt with it sufficiently in the one just finished.
I see.
It's not entering another incarnate body in a pure form.
Yeah.
Back, I got some unfinished business, or somebody owes me this, or I owe them that, or I want to help uplift the world, whatever, but you're not arriving unencumbered.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and that's that.
You just mentioned.
Yeah.
Nobody on a soul level is from the earth. Everyone is an alien. Everyone is from some other planet. I mean, the demographics of the earth population is the wildest demographic possible. In other words, from all possible types of sentient life forms. No one's from the earth. I mean, if you reincarnated on the earth, you could say I'm from the earth, but originally in your first lifetime, you came from someone else, somewhere else. Everyone is an alien. Everyone is an immigrant. Everyone is extraterrestrial from another planet. That's sort of the joke when they say there's no proof of extraterrestrial life. Every person walking around is a proof because no one is indigenous to the earth. It started off with no people. People had to come from somewhere. The Elohim didn't create the people here. I mean, they created the generic forms, but the souls that inhabited the body, sort of like the operators of the body, so to speak, they all derived from other planets across the galaxy. So everyone's an alien.
Yeah, that's I've heard it said like Earth is like almost like the school of hard knocks, right? It's like, or the quote unquote special ed of the universe, and people who haven't.
That's a disempowering statement that comes from the deep state puppeteers. It's like saying Earth is a minor planet, humans are idiots, and the things you just quoted, those are all lies. Those are all deliberate disinformation, propagandistic thought forms to keep people disempowered. If there's only 6 planets that have those unique aspects, and Earth is one of them, that statement that you quoted can't be true. It's not a school of hard knocks. It's a school of awesome possibilities. It logically
like that.
follows. You have to be careful. I'm always looking out for this because I'm both a writer and editor, for language that is inherently disempowering. Now, I don't mean in the secular sense of feminism or politics or Democrat Republican type of polarities. I mean, sort of at a deeper level that say humans are not of any consequence, or the planets of not of much consequence. We have to be very careful with the language. I used to be a medical writer, and I used to study the language that allopathic medicine, the allopathic medical world, that means conventional medicine, used when they were describing their medicines, their theories of illness, their theories of treatment and management. And a lot of the language is very similar to what you'd find in the military. It's a battle against cancer. It's a conflict. We're going to go in and kill it and napalm it. And the language is, all of that was inherently disempowering to consciousness. Said consciousness has no innate power to do anything. And you just translate that to an environmental policy for the planet, and you end up with people having no awareness of the light grid or their own possibilities of interacting with it as significant factors. I mean, it just builds, that kind of negative language just builds so that people end up thinking they can't have any significant effect on their outer reality, and they're of no consequence to anything, and the earth is sort of an afterthought. I mean, none of that's true, but it's part of the subconscious that passes for consensus reality. And the Satya Yuga is gradually uprooting all of that. It's a slow process, and it's an uncomfortable process because you sort of became accustomed to your Berlin walls in your consciousness, and you thought that there were absolute boundaries or absolute definitions. Whereas on a physical level, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, it was taken down in 1989. It's a very temporary barrier, although it was quite potent during those decades. So
I like
on the level, we have the same situation.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think language is really important to, it's a code, right? It's a way to influence consciousness. And you're absolutely right. And I think people say that, I think because in various channelings or whatever, like there's the concept that Earth and the idea that beings from other planets incarnated here are going through their learnings here because they may have failed on other planets, right? Maldek, Mars, other galaxies which housed intelligent life, which may have not met the threshold, so to speak, right? To enter into that higher life, they have to repeat in order to learn what they have to come. And so Earth, from what I understand, can be seen as like a hodgepodge of different groups, like you said, from all over the galaxy. And so that can create some very interesting situations and conflicts, from all this stuff that kind of has to be worked out. And that's in that sense, it's not as not as easy here as it would be elsewhere, so to speak.
Well, the challenge is tougher and the stakes are higher, but I would say it's more like having an all-expense paid vacation to Disneyland, or if you're wanting to go to college, if you're English, having all-expense paid education at Oxford or Cambridge, or in America, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, whatever is considered the top schools, as being invited to enter the top notch of something, not because you failed, but because you have shown excellence and there's a possibility of furthering your development in a planet that's designed for that. So I prefer to see it more in the sense of a positive possibility. People don't come to Earth because they screwed up somewhere else. They came here because, well, to use a contemporary example, it's why traditionally people from other countries have often wanted to move to the United States, because it was considered a place of great opportunity and all the other cultural benefits. I mean, the current situation, immigration, sort of confused that picture. But before that, it was considered a desirable possibility. In other words, it wasn't because they the last chance. It was more like, what a fabulous opportunity to have a better life. So if you think of the Earth in that same sense, it's a more empowering picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like, I've heard it's like there's a lot of demand, so to speak, to come here because of probably precisely because of what you're saying. You know, it's a accelerator, right? In that sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You'll have to, well, lots of people don't take advantage of that accelerated pace, but those who do can really make some progress. See, that's free will too. You can incarnate and just do nothing for your whole lifetime, or you can incarnate and make the best possible use of it, resolve your karma, gain some insights, have some hierophantic disclosures, and end up feeling like your time was well spent. It's your choice. That's the free will thing again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Richard, I think this is a good place for us to kind of end. This has been a fantastic. I always love having you on. This is it's always a great, insightful discussion, and honestly, we could go for even longer. But everyone who's listening absolutely must pick up this book. This is the Mythopoieic Planet. It's kind of getting blurred here, but here it is. Whoa, I don't know why it's doing that, but yeah, definitely check it out. Where can people buy it? Amazon. Yeah, Amazon. That's I've seen it on there, so definitely pick it up. But yeah, any final thoughts? Richard?
The Ofanim used to say to me, things are not what they seem. And even in my early Hobbit days, which I mean the days when I didn't have a clue and I was just barely getting my orientation, I would draw the wrong conclusions based on outer circumstance. I said, no, it's much more complicated. There's layers to it, and things are moving behind the surface you're not aware of. So you look at the outer world at the moment, it's culturally and politically tumultuous, not just in America, but everywhere. Everything is sort of in foment and uproar and discontent and complaint and progress and retrograde. I mean, it's a real circus. But you have to have a kind of positive picture of the intended outcome. In other words, this whole tumultuous period is actually carefully curated by both angelic realm, celestial great bright brotherhood, the archangelic brotherhood, so to speak, in conjunction with favorable large-scale astrological cycles, the golden age thing of 1.7 million years. In other words, it is ultimately progressing to a positive outcome, although it's bumpy and tumultuous and unpleasant, and sometimes is unbearable on the way to that. So you have to keep that larger picture. It's basically, I don't know, people of my generation grew up with Lord of the Rings way before the movies were made. And ultimately, Sauron was overthrown. They destroyed the ring, his power base was gone. Well, that's a good example. That was Tolkien's picture during World War I and World War II, which were pretty nasty times, but psychically, I would say what we're going through now is even worse than that, because the dark forces have gotten better at their propaganda. They've gotten better at manipulating the light grid, and therefore the gradient is a little stiffer. On the other hand, the astrology is against them. It's in favor of the light. So you have to keep that larger picture and be very careful not to succumb to negative language that disempowers. I don't mean disempowers like in terms of gender. That's sort of the bottom level of it. I mean, disempowers you as a generic human being, right? Words and language and concepts that make you feel you have no ability to affect anything. That's what you have to be careful about, because it's all a lie.
Absolutely. And, I think it's important to remember that, there's a lot of investment from higher forces to ensure that the earth manifests the potential that it was intended for, right? And so that they're not going to let it go. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Humans still have to participate. In the classical Greek plays, the characters would often get into such a tangle, and the playwright seemingly would get into such a tangle, they didn't know how to resolve the plot. So the gods would descend. It was called the Deus Ex Machina, the descent of the gods to fix the confused plot line. Well, it isn't going to work quite like that. They can nudge, they can't intervene, they can't descend and fix the plot. Humans have to step up and realize that they are potent and actors of considerable potency in affecting the good outcome. In a sense, humanity itself is its own Deus Ex Machina. We're going to intervene and fix the mess with some help from the sides, from the angelic realm, Great White Brotherhood, and the rest. But we still have to do our bit, and that's something a lot of people. It's not that they're lazy; it's just the religions have counseled them that it's not their role. It's the role of the priests and the saints and all the rest. It's a lie. It's our role. Every human on the planet can usefully contribute to that. You don't need that whole infrastructure. In fact, that's actually an impediment. So, absolutely.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for being on. Like I said, everyone needs to pick up a copy of your new book. Check it out on Amazon, and we'll definitely have you on again. This has been a great discussion. So thanks so much.
I've enjoyed it too.